So a couple of years back on the channel I reviewed a really enjoyable narrative adventure game called Road 96, which I repeatedly called Road 69 for some unknown reason, but this was a kind of choose your own adventure game which saw you playing as kids attempting to escape the fictional totalitarian nation of Petra, and all in all it was a pretty enjoyable play, with each run through having an impact on subsequent runs. But now comes the follow-up and prequel to that game, Road 96 Mile Zero, a game which follows a similar premise but puts a different spin on the formula, adding in some musical runner elements and opting for a more linear approach to its gameplay. But the question is, does it work and is it worth your time and cash? Well, hit that like button, subscribe for more reviews and Switch content, and let's find out. So the story in Mile Zero is set a few years before the events of the original and is essentially an origin story of one of its characters, that being Zoe, a trombone-packing teenager with somewhat of a troubled past, and her relationship with best friend Kaito, who also has his own demons to fight. But the two of them are basically living at each end of the social spectrum, with Zoe's father being a corporate bigwig, whilst Kaito and his family live in the slums. Zoe, of course, has been shielded all of her life from the realities of the state's wicked regime and is aware of its wrongdoings but still isn't ready to accept them, whilst Kaito has first-hand experience, having a strong hatred towards the government, which he's constantly trying to instill in Zoe. But there's some great contrasting themes going on in this one which show just how hard it can be to maintain a friendship when the rest of the world is working against you. Now, I'm not going to spoil the plot for you, but for the most part it's pretty enjoyable. There are some emotional ups and downs to be had, and the interactions between the main characters is good, and there are a few cameos from Road 96 characters which fans of the series will enjoy. However, I felt like the delivery of the story was really off-kilter in this one, with it constantly jumping from serious and somber moments to wacky and humorous without a moment's notice. And while the original did this to some extent, it was handled a lot more subtly, and for me the balance just wasn't right here, and it really took away from the thought-provoking subject matter that the game was attempting to deliver. Like its predecessor, you get to steer the narrative in different directions based on the dialogue options you select, which in turn affect your character's belief gauges and determine which endings you have available to you. But again, unfortunately your decisions don't really seem to hold the same weight, and apart from the endings, which I might add only have minor differences to them, they really don't have much of an impact on how the story plays out as a whole. Finally, I also felt like the musical elements didn't quite deliver their intended purpose, which, to quote the developer, was to represent strong moments in Kaito and Zoe's minds, and whilst I enjoyed the weirdness of them and they helped to spice up the gameplay variety, again they didn't really work for me in terms of delivering the narrative, as many of them were used in place of gameplay events where the first person perspective would have served better. Overall, the story was reasonable in Mile Zero, and it worked well to deliver a backstory and answer some questions about Zoe's past for those wanting to delve deeper, but ultimately it was nowhere near as engaging as the original, and for me its linearity really didn't warrant more than a single playthrough. Now, when it comes to gameplay, the format of Mile Zero is again similar to its predecessor, featuring a blend of first-person exploration, some minor puzzle elements and a few minigames for you to partake in, and throughout the game you'll be jumping back and forth, controlling both Zoe and Kaito as the story arcs unfold and intertwine with one another. But like I said, the game is very linear, so unlike the original, there's no real freedom here to explore. Each chapter though begins at the construction yard, the duo's makeshift hideout, and you're generally given a bit of dialogue to go through before gaining control of your character. And from here you're usually tasked with travelling to one of a couple of different areas, which include both Kaito and Zoe's neighbourhoods. Once there, you can choose to do a little more exploring and focusing on key objects to obtain a little extra lore, or hunt down stickers and cassette tapes which can then be displayed and played in your hideout. And while there are occasionally objects to interact with to influence your belief gauges, you generally push to just speak to people to progress the storyline before rounding things off with one of its musical segments. Now, as I said, these are intended to portray strong emotions in the characters' minds and so are often very abstract with the themes and visuals, but they're essentially arcade-like on-rails runner segments which have you skating and rail grinding your way through tracks to a variety of different tunes whilst avoiding obstacles by either sidestepping them or jumping or ducking under them. And they kind of have that high-speed Sonic Frontiers and Sayonara Wild Hearts vibe to them, and I have to admit, for the most part they're pretty enjoyable. Due to the windingness of these tracks though and constant camera shifting, you're often given very little time to react to the obstructions you face though, and colliding with any of them will reset you back a few seconds, which can become a little frustrating, but at least you have the option of bypassing them, as repeatedly doing this will give the option of skipping the segments entirely. And ultimately, your performance in these sections has no impact whatsoever, as at the end of them you're given a score which really serves no relevance, and you're able to replay any of them from the main menu should you want to improve on this at a later date. Overall though, these musical segments are a nice little diversion from the standard gameplay formula, but they're generally just a mixed bag in terms of their effectiveness as a story element. A couple of them present you with branching paths which, like the dialogue options, affect your belief gauges, and my favourite by far was Zoe's internal struggle about the realities of Colton City, which transitioned back and forth between her rose-tinted perspective and Kaito's opposing viewpoint. But like I said, they often replace gameplay segments where I feel the first person perspective would have served better and provided a much more engaging and dramatic narrative experience. In general, the core gameplay mechanics in Mile Zero are pretty solid, catering for fans of the original with the exploration elements, whilst also trying to bring a little more excitement with the musical segments. But I'm not entirely convinced the two work together as well as expected, and aside from the narrative elements tying the two together, they almost feel like two completely separate games. The puzzle elements in Mile Zero are also extremely simple and few and far between, and the minigames add in a little extra variety, but again serve as little more than distractions to pad out the spaces between the dialogue, which to me would be totally fine had the choice-driven narrative experience been the focus. But unfortunately, the linearity just doesn't allow for this, and the game just ends up feeling like a stripped back version of the original. For me though, Mile Zero is a game which doesn't quite know what it wants to be, both in terms of its narrative delivery and gameplay. But that being said, it's not a bad game by any means, and I feel like a lot of my criticisms stem from comparisons to the first game. And I'd say that if you're coming into this one without having first played Route 96, then I'm sure you'll have an enjoyable enough time with it. But after completing Mile Zero, I then recommend going ahead and giving the first game a go, because as a narrative experience, in my opinion it's leaps and bounds ahead of its successor and prequel. So visually we have the same cartoony art direction used in the original, with its bold colour palettes and highly stylised environments and characters, which as before I really liked. And I feel the strength of using this kind of visual style really gets to shine in the psychedelic music sections. But again, the Switch version doesn't deliver the best graphical experience, and as expected, there are plenty of frame rate drops which do have an impact on the overall immersion of the game. Audio wise, the sound design is definitely a strong point with this one, with some decent sound effects and voice acting throughout, though for some reason some of the lines of dialogue were left completely unvoiced. But for me the soundtrack was the star player here, with the licensed tracks from The Offspring, The Midnight, as well as some other artists that I never heard of, but tonally I felt all fit in really well and make the musical sections a joy to play through. Overall, decent stuff on the audio and visual front. So all in all then, while it doesn't quite live up to the expectations coming off the back of how good the original was, as a standalone experience, Mile Zero offers an enjoyable enough experience for fans of narrative exploration games, and the musical runner elements do add a little variety in there. But like I said, I'm not entirely convinced that the two work together quite as well as the developer had hoped. The narrative provides a nice insight into the backstory of Zoe, though its delivery is handled a little haphazardly at times, and the juxtaposition with the seriousness and humour feels a little off balance, but it's a decent story nonetheless. and while fans of the original might not find this one quite as enjoyable as someone new to the series, it's still well worth a punt in my opinion if you're desperate to dive back into Petra and discover a little more about its oppressive society and key players. When it comes to a rating though, today I'm going to be giving Route 96, Mile Zero, a very reasonable 3 out of 5 stars. Overall not a bad little prequel with some good ideas, but despite its reasonable playtime, in my opinion this is one that's best waiting for a sale on. With that said though, were you a fan of the original Road 96 and is Mile Zero one that you're interested in picking up, or will you be giving this one a miss? As always, let me know down in the comments section below, drop a like if this review helped you out, and subscribe to the channel for more Switch reviews and content. But for now, thanks once again for watching, take care of yourselves, and game on.